One of the most uncomfortable truths when it comes to keeping reptiles is this: not every reptile is right for every person. And that's not a judgment, it's just reality. A lot of problems in reptile keeping don't come from bad intentions, they come from people choosing animals that they were not realistically prepared to care for long term. Hey, I'm Clint with Crossstar Reptiles, and today we're going to talk honestly about how to choose the right reptile and why saying no to certain animals is actually part of responsible care. Um, Most reptiles don't end up in bad situations because somebody didn't care. They end up there because we underestimated something as keepers or breeders. Whether that is the size of the animal, the cost, the lifespan, the complexity of the care, or the time that needs to be invested. Reptiles don't grow at the pace of our excitement. They grow at the pace of their own biology. And when our expectations don't match that reality, the animal suffers. Um, and a lot of times we as keepers burn out. And this I don't want you to think that this is about gatekeeping. It's really about alignment. One of the biggest disconnects in reptile keeping is the size of the animal, or the size that that animal is going to become as an adult. When you go to pet stores or reptile expos, a lot of reptiles are sold as juveniles, and they're small, they're manageable, they're not intimidating. But that animal is going to grow, and the adult size affects everything. That's going to affect your enclosure size, the cost of your investment into that animal, the space in your home, even how to handle that animal safely. You know, um, there's a big difference in handling a 3 to 5 foot ball python than there is handling a 20 to 25 foot long retic. That's a huge difference. Um, and a reptile that fits comfortably, in a small aquarium on your dresser as a baby may eventually require a whole room in your house dedicated to that animal, or a very large, very expensive custom enclosure. So choosing a reptile means that you're choosing its adult form and not the version that you see when you're purchasing them as a juvenile. And that comes down a lot of times to impulse buying. When you are at pet stores or reptile expos, and uh, I think a lot of times with pet stores that don't care for their animals properly, as reptile keepers and breeders, we go in and we see that and we feel like we need to rescue that animal. But a lot of times, all we're doing is perpetuating that bad care, because when you purchase that animal, especially from a large chain pet store, they're going to have another one in there next week that's going to be in the same poor conditions. Um, and I know sometimes it's hard to just walk away, but if we continue to perpetuate that, then we're not doing anything to help the cause. And so rather than impulse buying, we need to take the time to make sure that we are prepared for that animal, for their size, and for their lifespan. A lot of reptiles may live 20, 30 years or longer. If you're talking tortoises, they can live 70, 80, 90 years or longer with proper care. And so that means when you move, or you change careers, or your family changes, or you have financial shifts in your life, all of that's going to happen, and that animal is still dependent on you. And a long lifespan isn't a bonus if you're not prepared for it. And it's our responsibility, because that deserves serious thought, and that animal deserves the best care possible. Um, and honestly, a lot of times we see reptiles labeled as beginner or intermediate or advanced. Um, but complexity, isn't just about your experience as a keeper. Just because an animal is labeled as advanced doesn't mean that it's a difficult animal. It just means sometimes that it's less forgiving when it comes to its husbandry. My crocodile skinks, I would consider them to be advanced because they have very narrow temperature ranges and strict humidity needs. Um, there are other animals that have very sensitive feeding responses, like my my Western hognose snakes, they can be very picky when it comes to eating and stress. Um, Leachianus geckos, especially when you get them as juveniles, if you move them around a lot or you handle them a lot, they will just stop eating altogether. And sometimes when you put them into a new enclosure, they may not eat for 2 to 3 months. And so it just leaves less room for error. And so experience helps. But if you've only ever kept a ball python, and then you're going to jump into something like, let's say, an Asian water monitor, um, that experience with the ball python isn't really going to carry over into caring for something like an Asian water monitor. What matters, I think, more than experience is the willingness to learn and consistency. Um, a simpler species that you care for well is going to outperform a complex species that is cared for inconsistently. Um, and I think this is where the rubber kind of meets the road. A lot of people are drawn to reptiles because of a specific animal that they've seen online or in a zoo or at an expo. And that interest makes sense. It's like me, if you saw our first week video when I was a kid, I was drawn to green iguanas, but I wasn't prepared to care for a green iguana. And the problem is not with wanting something impressive. The problem is when your interest in that animal doesn't line up with your ability to care for that animal. Um, so I want to give some specific examples. And again, I mentioned Asian water monitors. I love monitor lizards. Um, when I was a kid, I loved the old Godzilla movies, and I don't mean that 1999 travesty with the Taco Bell dog. I mean the old school Godzilla movies. Um, and so, iguanas and monitor lizards just kind of have that kind of dinosaur like feel. I love monitor lizards. They're extremely intelligent. They're active. They're just impressive animals. But with Asian water monitors, you have to have a massive custom enclosure that's going to support them structurally so that they can climb. That you can have, you've got to be prepared for a very high level food intake. You've got to have a level of space that allows them to climb as well as submerge themselves in water. And you're talking about a lizard that can get 10 feet long or more. Um, and wanting an Asian water monitor, there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that you're irresponsible. You're drawn to a highly active monitor type animal. Um, but if you're not prepared to have, let's say, an entire room of your house dedicated to this animal, there may be a better alternative. And that's why I raise Ackie monitors. I love monitor lizards, but I don't have the space for an Asian water monitor. Probably my favorite animal is the Komodo dragon. And again, you're talking about a very highly intelligent monitor lizard, but it's illegal to own a Komodo dragon, and you don't have to worry about an Ackie monitor eating you. So I have Ackie monitors, and there are other dwarf monitor lizards that may provide you a better alternative. Um, but I love the Ackie monitors. They still have that alert, interactive monitor behavior. They're highly intelligent animals. Um, there's even one video out there, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's a guy who uses mink to he trains them to hunt, and he has been training an Argus monitor to hunt like he does his mink. So monitor lizards are extremely intelligent, but Ackies have all of that, but in a size that is much more manageable. Um, and the experience is similar, but the scale is what's different. And so, if you want an Asian a water monitor, but you don't have the space, look into Ackie monitors. I think they are much, much more suitable. If you're drawn to snakes, another comparison I want to make is I mentioned reticulated pythons. Um, a reticulated python is also an intelligent animal, but it can exceed, 20, 25 feet in length. And when you've got an animal that large, it's an animal that you can't handle by yourself. And so you've got to have, very advanced handling skills, multiple people, reinforced enclosures, and a long term care plan. And so for somebody who's drawn to the idea of a large, impressive constrictor, you might want to look to a Burmese python. They still get large, but not quite as long as a retic. In my opinion, they also have a better demeanor than a reticulated python. But again, even with a Burmese python, you've got to have a very large enclosure. You're talking about an animal that can regularly get 15 to 20 feet in length. Um, and so maybe the better alternative is a ball python. They are much smaller. You're talking about an animal that may get 3 to 5 feet in length. Um, they're widely available. They have, probably at this point, thousands of different morphs, um, and a much more forgiving home environment while still offering that long-term experience. Um, and so if you're interested in those large snakes, reticulated python, Burmese python, even anacondas, there are other alternatives. And you say, well, I don't want a ball python. Well, there are still other animals out there, children's pythons or carpet pythons, things like that, boas. Um, and choosing, a ball python over a retic or, a boa over an anaconda, it's not that you're settling, but you're choosing sustainability and what's best for the animal. Um, again, when I was a kid, I loved green iguanas. But that's another animal that a lot of people underestimate. As juveniles, they're small, they're approachable, but as adults, they can become very large and strong, and they're arboreal, and they become territorial as well. And so, they need a very large space. They have, maybe some a little more complex dietary needs and behavioral needs, and they often exceed what people are planning on. When you can go to a pet store or an expo and pick up a green iguana for 20 or $30, uh, many people don't consider that in a few years that you know 15, 20-inch long juvenile is going to be a 4 to 6 foot long adult animal. Um, and so if somebody is drawn to the look and the movement of a green iguana, but you can't realistically provide a 10-foot by 10-foot enclosure, there are better alternatives. Something like a green anole, which is a very popular lizard. It's a much more manageable, still arboreal type lizard that allows for natural behavior and observation. They're still very pretty. They're very active. Um, and I know sometimes people would say, well, that's not exotic. That's just a common animal, and they want something that's more visually striking or cooler. So something like a jeweled lacerda, provides that kind of bold coloration and active behavior with a terrestrial setup that is still far more manageable than a green iguana. And when I say all this, the goal isn't to downgrade your experience. I want to foster the curiosity and the experience that people have with reptiles, but I also want you to be able to choose an animal that whose needs you can meet consistently. Um, and really, in every one of these examples, the principle is the same. It is wiser to ask, what aspect of that animal you're drawn to. Is it their size? Is it their behavior? Is it their activity level? Is it their appearance? And then find an appropriate species that matches those interests along with your ability to care for them. And don't get me wrong, if you have the means to provide a 10-foot by 10-foot enclosure for an iguana, or a 15 by 15 or 20 by 20 room for an Asian water monitor that has a large pond that they can get in, and trees that they can climb, and that's the animal of your dreams, and you can realistically care for them the right way and put in the work, then go for it by all means. But if not, then the best way that you can respect that animal and our hobby is by choosing something that you can care for the right way. Um, and a big part of that is understanding that the cost of these animals and the budget and the price of that reptile doesn't just stop at your initial setup or the initial purchase of that animal. Um, there are ongoing costs, that include your electricity, powering all of those different heating elements and lights, and food, and then replacing equipment because equipment does wear out, veterinary care, and sometimes it's hard to find exotic animal vets. Um, and then when you do, that cost may be more. Upgrading your enclosures as the animal grows. Those are costs that are normal. And responsible care means that you have to plan beyond, the first few months of care for that animal. And a lot of times what I see is people will buy reptiles for their children, but reptiles don't belong to kids. They belong to adults who provide the care for those animals. The kids can help and they can learn, and I believe that kids need to be taught responsibility, but ultimately the responsibility lies with the parent. And so when your expectations are clear, reptiles can be incredible educational tools, but when they're not, and when your expectations aren't where they need to be, it's the animals who suffer and pay the price. Um, and there's a difference, I think, in saying you shouldn't keep reptiles and saying that this reptile may not be right for you. I'm not saying don't keep reptiles. I'm saying find a reptile that matches your expectations and your ability to care, while also keeping you or your kids or whoever intrigued and interested in that animal long term. Choosing a reptile that fits your space and your lifestyle and your long term capacity is not settling. It's wisdom. And saying no to one animal, and that means also that you're saying yes to another one that's going to do much better in your care. So instead of asking, what reptile do I want? It's better to ask, what kind of reptile can I realistically provide consistently for the next 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years? And when that question comes first, I think the better decisions follow. And that's how animals thrive. That's how people stay in the hobby long term. Um, not every reptile is for everybody, and that's okay. Responsible reptile keeping isn't about collecting animals. It's not like Pokemon. We got to catch them all. It's about stewarding the ones that you choose well. And so, if this helps you think more clearly about that decision, then I hope it did its job. At Crossstar Reptiles, we believe that doing things right always matters. And again, I'm Clint. This is Crossstar Reptiles, and we're just getting started.